By the time it ended, it had cost 58,000 American lives, drained hundreds of billions of dollars from the US Treasury, toppled a presidency, and torn American society apart at the seams. Campuses in revolt, families divided over dinner tables, a generation forced to choose between the draft card and the border. And for the 3 million Vietnamese, Cambodian and Laotian people who died in the process, it was simply the deadliest chapter in a struggle for their homeland that had already been going on for decades. This is the story of how the United States found itself fighting a war 8,000 miles from home. A war it could not fully explain to its own people, could not win on the terms it set for itself, and could not walk away from without reshaping how America saw its place in the world. This is the story of Vietnam. To understand how America ended up in Vietnam, you have to start decades earlier, with a colonial power an ocean away. For nearly a century, Vietnam had been ruled by France as part of French Indochina. During World War II, Japanese forces occupied the region, and in the power vacuum that followed Japan's surrender in 1945, a Vietnamese nationalist and communist leader named Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence, quoting deliberately the American Declaration of Independence in his opening lines. France had other plans. Determined to reclaim its colonial territory, French forces returned to Vietnam, igniting a brutal anti-colonial war against Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces that would drag on for 8 years. Washington watched this conflict through the lens of an entirely different global struggle, the Cold War. American policymakers, gripped by fear that communism was spreading unchecked across Asia, began quietly bankrolling France's war effort first with money, then with mounting shipments of weapons and equipment, and eventually with military advisors. By the early 1950s, the United States was covering the majority of France's war costs, even as American troops themselves stayed largely on the sidelines. It wasn't enough to save France. In the spring of 1954, Viet Minh forces inflicted a devastating defeat on French troops at Dien Bien Phu, a battle that effectively ended French colonial rule in Vietnam for good. At an international conference in Geneva that summer, France agreed to withdraw entirely. The resulting Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, communist forces regrouping in the north under Ho Chi Minh, non-communist and pro-French factions consolidating in the south, with a nationwide election scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country under a single government chosen by the Vietnamese people themselves. That election never happened. Washington's read on the situation was blunt. American officials, including President Eisenhower himself, privately believed that if a free and fair national election were held, Ho Chi Minh would win by an overwhelming margin. Not necessarily because most Vietnamese were committed communists, but because he was the face of Vietnamese independence from colonial rule. To American strategists steeped in Cold War thinking, a unified, Ho Chi Minh-led Vietnam looked like a domino about to fall, one that could tip Laos, Cambodia, and the rest of Southeast Asia toward communism in turn. So the United States threw its support behind Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist Catholic politician, helping install him as the leader of a separate government south of the 17th parallel. Diem consolidated his authority through a referendum in 1955 that was, by most independent accounts, deeply fraudulent, a fact that would haunt the legitimacy of his government from the very start. It's worth pausing here to note the fundamental problem this created. Washington had positioned itself as a defender of democracy in South Vietnam while simultaneously helping suppress the very election that the Geneva Accords had promised, a contradiction that would complicate America's moral case for the entire war that followed. For the communist movement in the north and its sympathisers in the south, Diem's government and the American power backing it represented a betrayal of Vietnamese self-determination and a continuation of foreign domination under a new flag. That framing, whatever one makes of it, resonated with a great many ordinary Vietnamese who had spent generations fighting off colonial rule. In the years that followed, opposition to Diem's government in the south, organised largely through political means, protests, demonstrations, and public pressure campaigns demanding the elections promised at Geneva and basic civil liberties. Diem's government responded with sweeping crackdowns, arresting, imprisoning, and in many documented cases executing thousands of suspected communists and dissidents. Under mounting pressure and unable to achieve their goals through peaceful means, Communist Party leadership in Hanoi authorised the southern resistance to shift toward armed struggle. Throughout the late 1950s, armed uprisings spread across rural South Vietnam as communist-aligned forces seized territory, redistributed land to peasant farmers, and built up armed militias. By the end of 1960, these forces controlled significant portions of the countryside in the Mekong Delta, the Central Highlands, and Central Vietnam. That December, Southern revolutionary factions formally united under a single political umbrella, the National Liberation Front, commonly known to Americans as the Viet Cong. The Kennedy administration, inheriting this deteriorating situation, dramatically expanded American economic and military aid to Diem's government, while quietly increasing the number of US military advisors on the ground. South Vietnamese forces, trained and equipped by the Americans, launched what came to be called the Strategic Hamlet Program, an effort to forcibly relocate rural villages into fortified, controlled settlements, aimed at physically separating the civilian population from communist guerrillas. In practice, the program frequently alienated the very peasants it was meant to win over, uprooting families from ancestral land and, in many cases, pushing them further toward the insurgency rather than away from it. Despite American support, South Vietnamese forces struggled to contain the growing insurgency. Communist forces beat back numerous government offensives and inflicted steady losses. By the end of 1962, more than half of South Vietnam's rural hamlets and roughly 70% of the rural population remained effectively outside government control. In the cities, meanwhile, a very different kind of resistance was building. Students, Buddhist monks, and urban civilians staged mass protests against Diem's increasingly authoritarian and, to many Buddhists, religiously discriminatory rule. Images of Buddhist monks self-immolating in the streets of Saigon shocked audiences worldwide and made Diem's government look increasingly untenable, both to his own people and to the American officials who had propped him up. In November 1963, with tacit American approval, South Vietnamese generals led by Duong Van Minh staged a coup, assassinating both Diem and his brother. Rather than stabilising the country, the coup plunged South Vietnam into prolonged political chaos. More than 10 separate changes of government followed over the next 18 months, before generals Nguyen Van Thieu and Nguyen Cao Khai finally consolidated power in mid-1965. By 1965, watching South Vietnam's military position collapse alongside its political stability, the Johnson administration made a fateful decision to abandon the strategy of supporting South Vietnamese forces from behind the scenes and commit American combat troops directly to the war. The immediate pretext was the Gulf of Tonkin incident of August 1964, a murky naval confrontation off the Vietnamese coast whose details remain disputed by historians to this day, which Johnson used to secure sweeping congressional authorization for military action. What followed was a rapid, dramatic escalation. American combat troops began pouring into South Vietnam in large numbers, starting in 1965, eventually joined by forces from several allied nations, including South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand. At its peak, total Allied troop strength in South Vietnam approached 1.5 million, with American forces alone numbering over 500,000. Internal Pentagon planning documents from this period reveal a striking admission, by some officials' own private assessments, a significant majority of America's strategic objectives in Vietnam centered less on any clearly defined victory and more on avoiding the embarrassment of a visible American defeat, a rationale that would trouble war planners and, eventually, the American public for years to come. Backed by overwhelming firepower and technology, American forces launched sweeping search-and-destroy operations aimed at rooting out communist forces and pacifying contested territory. But the Vietnamese Communist forces fighting what they characterized as a people's war Blending regular North Vietnamese army units with local guerrilla fighters deeply embedded in rural communities proved remarkably resilient. Between 1965 and 1967, American and South Vietnamese forces inflicted heavy losses on Communist forces. By American estimates, well over 200,000 enemy combatants killed or taken out of action, including more than 100,000 identified as North Vietnamese regulars, while also suffering steadily mounting American casualties of their own. By early 1968, Communist military leadership in Hanoi calculated that conditions favoured a dramatic escalation and that a major offensive, timed to coincide with a contentious American presidential election year, might deliver a psychological blow substantial enough to shift American public opinion decisively against the war. The result was the Tet Offensive, launched on the night of the 30th of January 1968 during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year truce, a coordinated, simultaneous assault by Communist forces on cities and military installations across virtually the entire South. In Saigon itself, Communist commando units struck directly at the symbolic heart of American and South Vietnamese power attacking the USS. Embassy Compound, the Presidential Palace, South Vietnamese military headquarters, and Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Militarily, the offensive proved to be a significant tactical defeat for Communist forces. American and South Vietnamese troops, after initial shock, rallied and inflicted devastating casualties, and Communist forces failed to hold any of their major objectives or trigger the popular uprising they had hoped for. But Tet's true impact wasn't measured on the battlefield, it was measured in American living rooms. Television footage of Communist fighters breaching the grounds of the US Embassy, broadcast directly into American homes, delivered a psychological shock that no battlefield statistic could offset. For years, American military and political leaders had assured the public that victory in Vietnam was close at hand. Tet made that claim look, to a rapidly growing share of the American public, either dishonest or dangerously out of touch. Support for the war, already fraying, began collapsing in earnest. Even as the ground war raged in the South, the United States had, since 1964, been waging a parallel air campaign against North Vietnam, a sustained bombing effort aimed at crippling North Vietnamese industry and infrastructure, choking off supply lines to the south, and breaking the morale of the North Vietnamese population. North Vietnam, backed by Soviet and Chinese military aid, mounted an increasingly sophisticated air defence response. Over roughly 4 years of this air war, North Vietnamese forces claimed to have shot down more than 3,000 American aircraft and sunk well over 100 vessels. Figures that, while likely inflated in North Vietnamese accounting, nonetheless reflect a costly and grinding air campaign that never delivered the decisive results American planners had hoped for. Throughout the war, North Vietnam continued funneling troops and supplies south along an extensive, constantly rebuilt logistics network. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, running partly through neighbouring Laos and Cambodia. A network American bombing campaigns never managed to fully sever, despite years of trying. By 1968, in the wake of Tet and mounting American casualties, political pressure inside the United States had become impossible to ignore. Congressional leaders and an increasingly sceptical public pushed the Johnson administration toward negotiation rather than escalation. In June 1969, newly elected President Richard Nixon announced the beginning of American troop withdrawals and a reduction in the bombing campaign, a tacit admission that the strategy of large-scale, direct American military engagement had failed to produce the results Washington had promised. To reduce American casualties and quiet growing domestic unrest, the Nixon administration pursued a new approach it called Vietnamization, a gradual withdrawal of American combat troops paired with a major build-up of South Vietnamese military capacity, backed by continued American weapons, funding, and air support. On the 6th of June 1969, opponents of the Saigon government formally established the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam, positioning itself as an alternative political authority for the South. In the midst of this shifting strategic landscape, Vietnam suffered an enormous symbolic loss. On the 2nd of September 1969, Ho Chi Minh, the man who had led Vietnam's independence movement for decades, died. His death was a profound blow to Vietnamese communists, but it did little to slow the momentum of the war. Northern and southern communist forces pressed on, honouring what they described as his final wishes for national reunification. The war also spilled dramatically beyond Vietnam's borders. Between April and June 1970, American and South Vietnamese forces launched a major incursion into neutral Cambodia, targeting communist supply lines and base areas, an operation that provoked massive anti-war protests across American college campuses, including the shootings at Kent State University that left 4 students dead and further inflamed domestic opposition to the war. In February 1971, South Vietnamese forces, backed by American air power, launched a similar incursion into Laos, known as Operation Lam Son 719, aiming to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Both operations achieved only limited, temporary results, at a steep political cost back home. By early 1972, sensing an opportunity created by growing American war weariness and Nixon's domestic political pressures, North Vietnamese leadership launched the Easter Offensive, a large-scale conventional assault across the demilitarized zone and multiple fronts, aimed at delivering a decisive blow to South Vietnamese forces and strengthening Hanoi's position at the ongoing peace negotiations in Paris. The offensive achieved major early breakthroughs before South Vietnamese forces, heavily supported by American air power, managed to stabilise the front. In response to the offensive, Nixon authorised a renewed and intensified bombing campaign against North Vietnam beginning in April 1972. That December, with peace talks stalled, Nixon ordered the most intense sustained bombing campaign of the entire war, a 12-day assault using B-52 bombers against Hanoi, Haiphong, and other northern cities, intended to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table on more favourable terms. North Vietnamese air defences, better prepared and more capable than American planners had anticipated, shot down a significant number of B-52S during the campaign, a costly surprise for the US. Air Force and a moment North Vietnam would come to remember as a defining, if devastating, feat of resistance. Formal negotiations between the United States and North Vietnam had actually been ongoing, on and off, since shortly after the Tet Offensive in 1968, largely serving as a political stage for both sides rather than a genuine path to resolution, until the balance of power on the battlefield, combined with the political fallout from the December bombing campaign, finally pushed both sides toward a real settlement. On the 27th of January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, calling for a full withdrawal of American forces and mutual commitments not to interfere further in Vietnam's internal affairs. The South Vietnamese government, though deeply unhappy with terms it saw as effectively abandoning it to its fate, was pressured by Washington into signing as well. For all practical purposes, the accords marked the beginning of the end for the government in Saigon. American forces withdrew from Vietnam in the months that followed, though roughly 20,000 military advisors remained, and Washington continued providing significant aid to the South Vietnamese government. Despite the accord's ceasefire provisions, both sides continued limited offensive operations, as South Vietnamese forces attempted to reclaim contested territory, and Communist forces steadily regrouped and rebuilt their strength across contested regions in the years that followed. In late 1974 and early 1975, North Vietnamese leadership finalised plans for a final, decisive campaign to unify the country by force. What followed was a stunningly rapid collapse of South Vietnamese resistance. The campaign opened in March 1975, with a decisive assault on Buon Ma Thuot in the Central Highlands. When South Vietnamese counterattacks failed to retake the city, President Nguyen Van Thieu made the fateful decision to order a full withdrawal from the Highlands entirely, a retreat that quickly spiralled into disorder and collapse. City after city fell in rapid succession, Hue and Da Nang, by the end of March, as tens of thousands of retreating South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, overwhelmed and increasingly disorganised, streamed toward the coast. By April, North Vietnamese forces were closing in on Saigon itself. On April 18th, the American ambassador ordered the evacuation of remaining US personnel. 3 days later, President Thieu resigned. On the afternoon of the 30th of April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. Duong Van Minh, who had assumed the presidency only days earlier, announced an unconditional surrender. The war that had consumed Vietnam, in one form or another, for the better part of 3 decades, was over. In the months that followed, the last remaining pockets of South Vietnamese territory fell under communist control. In 1976, the country was formally reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, with Hanoi as its capital. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honour of the movement's late leader. The human cost of the preceding decades was almost unimaginable. An estimated 1 to 3 million Vietnamese military and civilian deaths, alongside significant losses in neighbouring Cambodia and Laos, and 58,000 American service members killed. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, fearing persecution or unable to accept life under the new government, fled the country in the years that followed, many by sea, refugees who came to be known around the world as the Boat People, a humanitarian crisis that drew global attention through the late 1970s and 1980s. Vietnam's troubles didn't end with reunification. Beginning in December 1978, Vietnamese forces intervened in neighbouring Cambodia to overthrow the brutal Khmer Rouge regime, whose genocidal policies had killed an estimated 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians. Vietnamese troops remained in Cambodia for roughly a decade before withdrawing once the country stabilised. That intervention, in turn, provoked a brief but bloody border war with China in early 1979, and diplomatic relations between the two communist neighbours remained frozen for over a decade afterward. Territorial disputes from this period, particularly over the Paracel and Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, parts of which China seized by force in 1974 and 1988, remain unresolved contentious issues between Vietnam and China to this day. For the United States, the war left scars that outlasted the conflict itself by generations, a lasting public skepticism toward military intervention abroad, often referred to as the Vietnam Syndrome, a reformed relationship between the press, the public, and the military, and a hard-won recognition of the limits of American military power against a determined, deeply rooted insurgency. For Vietnam, the post-war decades brought their own transformation. Beginning in 1986, Vietnam's Communist Party leadership launched a sweeping set of economic reforms known as Doi Moi, gradually opening the country to market-oriented policies and international trade. Vietnam normalised relations with both China and, in 1995, the United States itself, joining the wider community of nations and becoming, in the decades since, one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Frequently cited alongside Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines as one of Asia's rising economic powers. Vietnam remains one of the most contested chapters in modern history, a war whose causes, conduct, and consequences are still debated by historians, veterans, and the descendants of everyone it touched. What's beyond dispute is its scale of loss, and the way it forced both the United States and Vietnam to reckon, each in their own painful way, with the limits of power, ideology, and national will. If you found this deep dive into one of the 20th century's most consequential conflicts valuable, subscribe to Timeless Chronicles, and let us know in the comments which era of history you'd like us to explore next.